The lecture hall of the Vorkai Academy of Interstellar Sciences held, on that particular morning, approximately 63 students from 9 different species. Smooth stone-gray walls curved upward into a vaulted ceiling that hummed faintly with climate regulation. Rows of tiered seating descended toward a central stage where Professor Delcan stood, adjusting the holographic projector with the practiced calm of someone who had delivered this exact lecture 41 times in 22 years. Delcan was Soreni, pale blue skin, faint gold freckles dusting his cheekbones, a narrow ridge where a human nose would be, and 2 sharp silver eyes that had seen more of the galaxy than most admirals. His collar bore 3 amber rank lights, which meant, in the Soreni system of academic hierarchy, that you did not question him unless you were prepared to be embarrassed publicly and professionally. He was, in the words of his student evaluation forms, thorough, brilliant, and somewhat terrifying. Today's lecture was titled, in the official curriculum, Planetary Classification and Biological Threat Assessment. But everyone in the hall knew it by its informal name, the Deathworld Lecture. The one where Professor Delcan pulled up the list of Class 7 and Class 8 worlds and let the students sit in horrified silence for a few minutes before explaining, very calmly, why no species with any survival instinct ever colonized them. The holographic display bloomed open above the stage. A rotating globe filled the center of the room, blue and green and white, streaked with brown and gray. Designation, Delcan said, UX-3-7, Common Name Earth. Class 7, Death World. Primary Intelligent Species, Homo sapiens. Currently registered as Allied Observers under the Interstellar Compact. Someone near the back laughed. Not loudly, just a quiet, involuntary sound of disbelief. Delcan did not look up. "Go ahead," he said. "It is an appropriate reaction." Sitting in the 3rd row was a student named Yeva Malone. She was human. 19 years old, born in Krakow, Poland, with brown eyes, sharp cheekbones, and dark hair pulled into a braid that she had been redoing since the shuttle ride over, because nerves made her fidget. She was one of 4 humans enrolled at Vorkai Academy that semester. She was also, by a significant margin, the youngest student in this particular lecture hall. She had been excited about this class. She had told her mother, over a long-distance comm call 2 weeks ago, that comparative planetology was going to be her favorite subject. She was currently reconsidering that opinion. The holographic Earth rotated slowly above her head as Professor Delcan began listing, in his precise and academic tone, all of the reasons her home planet should not, by any reasonable biological logic, support a civilization of any kind. 71% of the surface is covered in saline water at depths reaching 11 kilometers, he said. The remaining landmass is distributed across tectonic plates that shift constantly, producing seismic events, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis on a regular cycle. The atmosphere contains, at ground level, enough oxidizing agents to corrode unprotected metal alloys within weeks. The temperature range, across a single planetary year, spans from -80 degrees to +56 degrees Celsius in inhabited zones, not extreme zones, inhabited ones. He paused. The class was very quiet. The primary megafauna, he continued, clicking to the next slide, includes species capable of dismembering most sentient beings with minimal effort. There are insects on this planet, small insects, smaller than my thumb, that transmit fatal neurological diseases with a single bite. There are plants, that produce contact toxins strong enough to cause systemic organ failure in 7 out of 9 registered alien species tested. the Tharak student 3 seats to Yeva's left. A tall, young male named Osrin with bronze skin and thin facial ridges leaned over to his friend and whispered something. Both of them looked at Yeva. Both of them were smiling. Not unkindly, just with the specific expression of someone who has just learned a fascinating and horrifying fact about their classmate's hometown. Yeva kept her face very still. Delkan moved to the next section, atmospheric storms. He described a hurricane with the same tone a tour guide might use for a mildly interesting museum exhibit. He described a tornado. He described hailstorms, which he classified as, and he used this exact phrase, random projectile precipitation events. The class started making quiet noises of disbelief at semi-regular intervals. Then he reached the section on Earth's moon, and he paused, just slightly, the way a person pauses before saying something that still surprises them even after 41 lectures. The gravitational relationship between Earth and its natural satellite, he said, produces tidal forces that shift coastal geography on a twice-daily cycle. This is not unique. What is unique is that the humans evolved on this planet. Not near it, not in a protected habitat on it, on the open surface of it, breathing the oxidizer atmosphere, drinking the saline-adjacent groundwater, coexisting with the megafauna. He looked up at the class, voluntarily. Osrin raised his hand. Professor, when you say coexisting, you mean they developed technology to protect themselves from the fauna early on? No, Delkan said. I mean, they did not. For the majority of their evolutionary history, they had no technology. They were, by galactic classification standards, prey animals, mid-tier prey animals. No natural armor, no venom, no enhanced musculature by comparative standards, relatively slow on open ground. They cannot see in the dark. They have one stomach. Silence. One, Delkan repeated, because he always repeated it, because it never stopped being remarkable. Yeva had her notebook open on her desk. She had stopped writing new notes about 6 minutes ago. She was now, instead, writing a very small list of things she wanted to say. She was not going to say them. She was absolutely not going to raise her hand in the middle of Professor Delkan's lecture to argue with him about anything. She was 19. He had 3 amber collar lights. This was not a situation where raising your hand helped anyone. She drew a small bracket around the list. She underlined one item. Then Professor Delkan said something that made her put the pen down. This is, of course, why the Deathworld classification system exists. Not as an insult to any species that originates from such environments, but as an acknowledgement of a fundamental truth. Civilizations from Class 7 worlds carry survival adaptations that are, by definition, extreme. They are shaped by environments that no rational species would choose, and as a result, they develop psychological and physiological profiles that are, he chose his next word carefully, unusual. He clicked to a new slide. Population growth models, conflict indices, early expansion patterns. Humans, he said, began their space program in earnest while still engaged in multiple active planetary wars. Not historical wars, concurrent ones. They launched their first crewed vessel to their own moon, while 2 major geopolitical blocs were pointing nuclear weapons at each other. They continued. The conflict did not stop the program. The program did not stop the conflict. Both, simply. He paused. Continued. Someone in the back row laughed again. This time, it was not quiet. Yeva raised her hand. The room went very still. Delkan looked at her. He had, in 22 years of teaching, had precisely one student interrupt the Deathworld lecture before the designated question period. He looked at her for a moment the way you look at something unexpected. Not angry, just recalibrating. "Yes," he said. Yeva stood up. "Because on Earth, when you have something important to say, you stand up." She was not sure if that was a human thing or a Polish thing or just a her thing. It did not matter. "Professor," she said, with respect, "you have described my planet as a place that produces unusual psychological profiles because the environment is extreme. But you have been describing the environment as the active force, and the humans as passive products of it, as if we were just shaped by pressure, like clay." Delkan tilted his head. The gold freckles on his cheekbones caught the projector light. "That is, broadly, how evolutionary biology works," he said. "For every species." "No," Yeva said, politely, firmly. "Not for us." The room was very quiet now. Even Osrin had stopped leaning toward his neighbor. "The examples you gave," she continued, "the wars running parallel to the space program, the contact with megafauna without early technology, the expansion into extreme climates before modern protection, gear. You presented those as symptoms of a chaotic or irrational civilization. But every single one of those things has a different explanation, if you look from the inside instead of the outside." Delkan clasped his hands behind his back. "I am listening," he said. And he genuinely was. That was the thing about Delkan. He was precise and occasionally terrifying, but he was not at his core closed-minded. Yeva took a breath. "The reason we ran a space program during active global conflict was not because we were irrational. It was because both sides understood, separately but simultaneously, that whoever reached orbit first would have a decisive strategic advantage. The space race was not separate from the conflict. It was a direct extension of it. We turned a war into a competition to leave the planet. And then we left the planet." She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "The reason early humans coexisted with megafauna without armor or venom or speed is because we did something none of those animals could do. We remembered. We talked to each other. We told stories around fires about which animals killed which people and exactly how it happened, so that the next generation would know before they encountered it. We built knowledge systems instead of biological defenses. We outsourced our armor to our brains, and then, eventually, to metal, and then to spacecraft." Osrin was not smiling anymore. He was listening. "And the psychological profile you called unusual," Yeva said, "the part where humans seem to move toward danger instead of away from it. That is not irrationality. That is a calculated behavior pattern that evolved because, on a Class 7 world, staying still is statistically more dangerous than moving. Stasis equals death on Earth. Motion equals survival. We learned that before we had language to describe it. It is not in our culture. It is in our bodies." She paused. Her heart was going very fast. Her voice was not shaking. She had practiced that, specifically the not shaking part. "You asked why we would choose to live on a world like that," she said. "We did not choose it, but we did choose to stay. Every generation, we looked at everything the planet could do to us, and we decided it was worth it. Not because we were forced to, because the same world that produces hurricanes also produces things that are, in our opinion, worth surviving hurricanes for." She sat down. The holographic Earth was still rotating above the stage, blue and green and white. Professor Delkan stood very still for a moment. The amber lights on his collar were the only movement in the room. Then he looked at the class. Then he looked at the display. Then he looked with an expression that 22 years of students had never quite seen on his face before, back at Yeva. "Miss Malone," he said. "Yes, Professor." "That answer," he said, "is going into the curriculum." He turned back to the display. He clicked to a new slide. He had never shown this slide during the Deathworld lecture before. It had been sitting in his files for 3 years because he could never find a natural entry point for it. It was titled, "Strategic Advantage of High-Stress Origin Species." "I believe," he said very calmly, "we have found our entry point." The new slide hung in the air above the stage like a quiet accusation directed at every previous version of this lecture. Professor Delkan let it sit there for a moment. He was not a dramatic man by nature, but even he understood that some moments deserved a breath of silence before you moved through them. "For 22 years," he said, "I have taught this lecture as a classification exercise. Here is the world. Here are the conditions. Here is why no rational civilization would emerge from it. And the implicit conclusion, which I never stated aloud but which every student in every iteration of this class absorbed anyway, was this: Deathworld species are curiosities, fascinating, occasionally impressive, but ultimately products of suffering rather than architects of progress." He looked at the slide. "Miss Malone has just identified the flaw in that framework, in approximately 90 seconds, without notes." Yeva, in the third row, was looking at the desk in front of her with the focused expression of someone trying very hard not to react visibly to a compliment delivered in front of 62 other students. She was not entirely succeeding. Osrin, 3 seats to her left, glanced at her with an expression that had shifted completely from the quiet amusement of 20 minutes ago. He looked now like someone reassessing a situation they thought they had already understood. Delkan clicked forward. The new slide expanded into a branching diagram. At the top, the words "high-stress origin species." Below that, 3 branches, each one labeled with a category Delkan had compiled over 3 years of quiet research that he had never, until this moment, felt confident enough to be present as curriculum. "Branch 1, he said. "Adaptive problem architecture. This is the academic term for what Miss Malone described informally as outsourcing armor to the brain. Species that evolve on low-threat worlds develop problem-solving capacity as one tool among many. Species that evolve on high-threat worlds develop it as the primary tool. The only tool, in many cases. The result is not simply higher intelligence. It is a different relationship with intelligence itself." He moved a pointer across the diagram. "Soreni children, my own species, learn threat assessment in controlled educational environments. We are taught which situations are dangerous. We develop pattern recognition from instruction. Humans develop it from experience, from failure, from loss, from watching something go wrong and immediately asking, why did that go wrong? And how do I make sure it does not go wrong the same way twice?" He paused. The Sereni word for this approach does not translate well into galactic standard. The closest translation is learning by surviving. We consider it a primitive method. We are, perhaps, wrong about that. A Varen student near the back, a young female named Kala with sand-gold skin and small pointed ears, raised her hand. "Professor, are you saying that stress origin species are better problem solvers than low-threat species?" "I am saying," Delkan replied carefully, "that they are differently equipped, and that in certain categories of problem, in specifically novel threats, unstable environments, and situations with incomplete information, the stress origin architecture has a measurable advantage. Yes, Kala wrote something in her notes, quickly, like she did not want to forget it. Yeva was now writing again too, but not the small private list from before. She was writing actual notes, real ones, because this version of the lecture was something she had not expected and was not going to let go past without recording every word. She had not come to Vorkai Academy to be a spectacle. She had come because her scores in xenobiology and comparative systems theory were high enough to earn a full scholarship, and because her mother had told her, over that same long-distance call 2 weeks ago, that if she had the chance to sit in rooms where the galaxy's best minds argued about how the universe worked, she should take it and not waste a single hour being quiet. Her mother had a tendency to be right about things. Yeva had still not entirely planned to raise her hand. That had been, in the moment, a decision made somewhere between her brain and her spine without proper committee review. But it was done now, and Professor Delkin had not thrown her out. He had put her answer in the curriculum. She was going to have to calm her mother about this. Her mother was going to be insufferable about it. Delkan moved to the second branch of the diagram. Threat normalization, he said. This is the one most alien observers find difficult to understand about Deathworld species, and humans in particular. The ability to function at full cognitive capacity in the presence of active danger. He brought up a secondary display alongside the main diagram. It showed a study, a real one, from the Galactic Institute of Behavioral Research, comparing stress response patterns across 14 species. The graph was simple: cognitive performance on the vertical axis, environmental threat level on the horizontal axis. For most species represented, the line sloped downward as threat increased. Sharply, in some cases. For the human sample group, the line did not slope downward. It sloped upward, slightly, but unmistakably upward. The class looked at the graph in silence. "They get better," Osrin said quietly. He was not asking. He was just saying it out loud, because saying it out loud was the only way to confirm that he was reading the graph correctly. "Marginally," Delkan said. "In the short term. The long-term data shows eventual degradation under sustained extreme stress, as with all biological systems. But the short-term curve. Yes, under acute threat conditions, the average human cognitive performance index increases by between 3 and 7%. He let that settle. To put that in context, he added, the average Sereni performance index under the same conditions decreases by 22%. The average Theric index decreases by 18%. The Viren index decreases by 31%. Kala looked at the graph with an expression that suggested she was reconsidering several things simultaneously. "This is why," Delkan continued, "the question of how humans manage to develop a space program while engaged in active conflict is not, as it might appear from the outside, a symptom of disorder. It is a demonstration of a cognitive architecture that does not have a reliable off switch for high-functioning behavior under pressure. They are not brave in the way we typically define bravery. Bravery, in most species, is the act of overcoming fear to function. For humans, the wiring runs differently. Danger does not suppress function. It sharpens it." He clicked to the third branch. "Which brings us to the final category, collaborative escalation." This was the branch Yeva had not seen coming. She sat forward slightly. "One of the most documented human behaviors in first contact and early alliance scenarios," Delkan said, "is their tendency to respond to a shared external threat by immediately and instinctively forming cooperative structures with whatever group is available. including groups they were in direct conflict with moments before. He brought up a historical record, a real one, from Earth's own archives that the human government had submitted as part of their Allied Observer Registration documentation. It was a case study from the 20th century, a period Delcan had always considered one of the more instructive chapters of human history, specifically because of how densely it packed catastrophe and innovation into a single 100-year window. In 1943, he said, pronouncing the Earth date with the careful accuracy of someone who had practiced it, two nations that were actively trying to destroy each other's military forces coordinated a joint rescue operation to recover the crew of a downed aircraft behind hostile lines. The operation succeeded. Afterward, both sides went back to fighting. There was no treaty, no formal arrangement, no lasting ceasefire. They simply helped each other because someone needed help, and then continued the war. The room was quiet. "This is not an isolated incident," Delcan said. "It is a pattern, documented across centuries, across conflicts, across cultural and ideological divisions that by any reasonable external analysis should have made cooperation impossible. Humans cooperate across lines that other species treat as permanent, and they do it quickly, without extensive negotiation frameworks, without diplomatic pre-clearance." He paused, sometimes without even speaking the same language. Yeva looked up from her notes. Delcan was looking at her, not in the way a professor looks at a student when they are making an example of them, in the way one thinking creature looks at another when they are confirming a hypothesis in real time. "Miss Malone," he said, "you are currently attending an academy populated by 8 species that your planet was not in formal contact with 40 years ago. You are sitting in a lecture hall designed for Sereni physiology, calibrated for Sereni atmospheric preference, lit at a spectrum optimized for Sereni visual range, and you raised your hand." He let that sentence finish itself. "Yes," Yeva said. "Was that," he asked, "a calculated decision?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said, "but that is kind of the point, isn't it?" Delcan held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned back to the class. "The point," he said, "is that what the classification system calls a death world does not produce damaged species. It produces species that have internalized, at a cellular level, a set of operational truths that the rest of the galaxy is still learning from controlled environments and textbooks." He closed the branching diagram. The holographic Earth came back to the center of the room, still rotating, still blue and green and white. "Humanity did not survive their planet by accident," he said. "They survived it by building, generation by generation, an entirely different relationship with difficulty than any low-threat civilization has ever had to develop. And then they brought that relationship with them into this academy, into this compact, into every room they have walked into since first contact." He looked at the display for a moment. Then he looked at the class. "The question I have asked at the end of this lecture for 22 years is, what does the existence of Deathworld species mean for the future of galactic civilization? I have always answered it myself, because no student has ever offered a response I considered complete." He looked at Yeva. "Miss Malone, would you like to answer it?" Yeva stood up again, same as before, steady voice, beating heart. "It means," she said, "that the galaxy's next hard problem, whatever it is, already has a species that spent 100,000 years practicing for it. And that species just got access to the rest of the galaxy." She sat down, The room was very still. Then Osrin, 3 seats to her left, put his hands together in the Tharic gesture of formal acknowledgement. The bronze ridges on his cheeks caught the light. He was not smiling anymore. He was doing something more serious than that. He was showing respect. One by one, across the lecture hall, other students followed. Professor Delcan stood at the front of the room with his hands clasped behind his back and his silver eyes very calm, watching 62 students from 80 different species acknowledge a 19-year-old girl from Krakow, Poland, who had interrupted his lecture because something needed to be said, and no one else in the room had grown up on a world that taught you to say it. He made a note in his curriculum file. Then he said quietly,